Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our Harvard Classics lectures. We are now turning to the volume number 16. This is lecture number 77. We are working now with the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, maybe one of the single most read and referred to texts of all of the texts of the Harvard Classics. And I will say this as well, without question, if you pick this book up and actually read it, you are going to be shocked at what's inside. Disney will only give you half the story, if you get my drift. Now, this is really a great book about storytelling. Remember what we said? You are the stories you tell, we are the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. In many ways, we're going to see this to be the case in both positive ways as well as in deeply, deeply disturbing ways. Hey guys, I got to say this out loud just to start. While reading the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, as it's sometimes referred to, is a fun read in a lot of ways, anyone that picks this book up and goes 10, 15, 20 pages into it is immediately shocked by the racism and as well by the negative, suspicious views of women. Without a question, this is a very disturbing text in that regard. Doesn't mean that we don't read it, doesn't mean that we don't appreciate it, but we got to say out loud right away, there is an origin for Shakespeare's Othello and the suspicions that are involved in Shakespeare's Othello, and in many ways it's a text like this. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, I recommend that you go there, find our Harvard Classics lectures in the previous 76 lectures. To be honest, though, we really haven't seen a text like this one in the Harvard Classics yet, and to that degree, we'll pick it up and we'll look at it as a peculiar in some ways kind of text in which we have a storytelling approach that's quite remarkable. We're going to call it if you're a Shrek fan, the parfait approach or the onion approach, stories within stories within stories. Just to remind, our learning theory here is to relate new information to old information in meaningful ways. Notice I've already mentioned that Disney only got half the story, for example, with the story of Aladdin. We'll get to it. We also want to remind you that we are reading at 3 different levels. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Here we subdivide, right? Themes, messages, as well as at level 2b, conflict. We're going to pay, the rhetorical level of reading. We're going to pay attention to the conflicts that are inherent here. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a, how do I relate to other titles? Notice I just mentioned Shakespeare's Othello. How do I relate to other titles? And then finally, how do I relate to myself at 3b? How do I relate to myself personally? Now let's just get some background information. This is one of those amazing texts that everyone has kind of heard about the Arabian Nights, but doesn't really know a whole lot about it. And I've even had students that say, it's an actual text. Check this out. It is a collection of Middle Eastern folktales compiled in Arabic during what is often referred to by scholars as the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 8th to the 14th century. Collected over many centuries, so it's an anthology of collection of stories over many centuries, various authors, various translators, various scholars involved in the compilation. Its roots are both ancient as well as medieval, and we've as well got Arabic, Persian, Indian, Greek, Jewish, Turkish, all involved in the compilation. It is a frame story, so put that in your notes. It is a frame story, and by that we mean that we have Shahryar, who is this ruler, sultan type, who is going to, for reasons that we'll talk about, have deep suspicion of women, and so he's going to marry a virgin, sleep with her on that night, and then kill her the next day, leading then to a young lady who actually volunteers for this duty, Shahryar. And Shahryar is going to, she's going to keep herself alive by basically telling stories every night to Shahryar, the Sultan. And in this process, not only does she save her life, but she as well provides some of the great stories. Of course, we mentioned already Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, which is interesting because it originally apparently wasn't a part of the Arabian Nights. The Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves story, as well as Sinbad. Again, these are all famous stories along with a whole bunch of other tales. Now what this volume does for the Harvard Classics is to not provide all of them. I mean, think about it. If you only provided 1 page for each story and it's 1001 nights, and every night you have a different story, you've got 1,000 pages of story, so you get the drift. Anybody who's actually sat down and read all of the 1001 nights stories is obviously going to have accomplished a major feat, no question. with that in mind, there are some really famous stories, and I wish, guys, I could go through all of these stories with you. The Fisherman and the Jinn, or the Genie, is a famous one. The stories of Sinbad we've already mentioned. We're going to pay attention primarily to the stories of Aladdin and Ali Baba, only because those are stories that you probably are quasi-familiar with. But you're going to be shocked when you maybe pick up the text and read these stories, and that's always my intent, right, is that you will actually go and read these on your own. You're going to be maybe a little bit shocked. Whoa, no way. For example, Aladdin is a story that is set in the Arabian Nights, in 1001 Nights, set in China. Whoa, no kidding. We'll take a look at it. First of all, we've got the introduction, and this is an extremely controversial and entertaining series of storytellings, but no question, very, very controversial. To begin with, we've got two brothers, and Shahryar is the older of the two brothers. Shah Zaman is the younger, and Shah Zaman sees his wife messing around, having sex, and he kills both the wife as well as the lover. It is made explicitly clear that the woman, his wife, is in fact messing around with black slaves. This racism is going to be endemic to this text, especially in the beginning. And Shah Zaman then will visit his brother Shahryar, and will in fact discover that Shahyar's wife is also messing around with black slaves in this kind of almost like orgy passage, and then decides to let Shahryar know, and through all of this, there's this kind of suspicion of women thing that we want to pay attention to. The brothers will run away. They're visited by a beautiful woman, a genie. This is going to be a part of the stories over and over again. They will return. Shahryar will kill his wife and never trust women again. And again, as we said, he's going to take a virgin every night, and he's going to sleep with her. But then he's going to, after he marries her, but then he's going to kill her. And ultimately, he runs out of possible wives, either because all of the virgins will flee, or because his vizier, his helper, I can't find any more women. The vizier has a daughter, and this is Shahrazada, and one of the great heroines in all of history, in the history of literature. Shahrazada is a girl who will in fact volunteer, says, "Let me go." And once she's there, the father, of course, says, "Absolutely not." You get this really interesting story about talking animals and all of that, but ultimately the father will say, "Fine, fine, fine, I'll let you go." And when Shahrazada gets there, she will say, in fact, to the Sultan, "Will you let me bring in my sister?" And because every night I tell her stories. And this will be that kind of setup then, we call it a frame story, where she's going to tell these interesting stories, but always leave like a cliffhanger almost of a kind, or one story that will lead into the next story. This is what we mean by that onion motif. And so she begins to tell these stories. Well, ultimately, of course, these stories will in some ways save not just her life, but will begin to as well kind of in some ways help to elucidate or enlighten this Sultan who has such negative views towards women, and of course is distrustful of any number of other people and types of people. The stories that are told in the 1001 Nights then share this common trait of suspicions of women, suspicions of other people, we can call them the foreign, the possibility that genies are going to be able to somehow show up and all of a sudden, solve problems and the like. The Aladdin story comes to mind, so let's play the game really quickly with that one. This is originally not a part of the 1001 Nights, and yet it is a story that you've probably heard parts of it, but there's a whole lot of the story you probably don't know about unless you picked up the book to read it. As I said already, it's a story that is set in China. Right away we have a Moor, that is to say a black man. We've got some racism going on. And if you want to find usually a bad guy in these stories, usually is a black person. And in that regards, again, the racism is endemic. I think that when we say that we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, I think it's very clear that this text that was so popular for so many readers over the years subtly sends that message that the black individual is somehow suspicious and is needing to be watched closely, especially as it relates to the whole issue of sexuality in women. so much of it is tragically derived from the reading of this text. And with that in mind, often so much of that is excised from the telling of the story. We clearly want to be intellectually honest here and point out that this is a very dangerous text in the history of the world for that reason. But here we'll have a man who will show up and will pretend to tell Aladdin that he is in fact his uncle. And he promises Aladdin all kinds of wealth. The magician, often as he's referred to, will take Aladdin to a cave and he will tell him, I need you to give me a lamp. The magician will actually give Aladdin a magic ring as protection. So for those of you who are fans of Tolkien, or your Plato's Republic and the myth of Gyges story with the magic ring, we now have a magic ring, which will provide a part of the story later on for us. Aladdin will in fact find the lamp, but he refuses to give it ultimately to the magician, and the magician will lock him up in this cave. He will use the magic ring to escape home. It will be Aladdin's mother, who's an interesting woman in this story, who will try to clean the lamp, and then all of a sudden a powerful jinn or genie will exit from the lamp. And here the genie will give them a feast. She will give them jewels to lure the Sultan's beautiful daughter for Aladdin, and ultimately will help Aladdin to get the Sultan's daughter through a series of escapades that I won't get into. Meanwhile, back in Africa, the magician will learn about this situation with Aladdin, figure out that in fact he must have gotten out of the cave with the lamp, and the bad magician, as he's referred to, will come back through a series of events, will steal the lamp, and then ultimately tries to get Aladdin's girl. So you can see the reversal of fortune for Aladdin. Aladdin then will use his ring and to find his wife. His wife will then dope and kill the magician. Again, the storyline of be aware of the woman. In fact, I can just pause here. In the opening lines of the introduction, in fact, of this story, we have this notion in a series of poetic lines that run something like this. Never, quote, I'm reading now, never, we're 10 pages in on this reading in the introduction. Never trust in women, nor rely upon their vows. For their pleasure and displeasure depend upon their passions. They offer a false affection. Whoa. And the passage goes on. I won't continue to read it, but you get the drift of this. Of course, we could pause at 3a and make the observation that this is exactly what the wife of Bath, Chaucer's wife of Bath, had to say about men always accusing women as being the source of all evil in the world. Who wrote these books? These stories are usually written by men. Let the stories be written by women, and we'd probably have a completely different orientation of why bad things happen in the world. And needless to say, Aladdin then will, through the use of his wife, will ultimately kill the magician. We've got the follow-up story, and this seems to happen in these stories where you have a second story behind the first story. The magician has a brother. The brother comes to seek revenge. Ultimately, Aladdin has to kill him as well. So in other words, in these stories, and kind of surprising, Aladdin is in fact not just a wisher, but is also a killer, which is an interesting part of the story that Disney decides to kind of completely leave out. If we were working at 2A with a story like this, we would say maybe that success does come to the hard-working youth, ultimately, right? Although Aladdin in the story is ironically lazy at first. He won't do anything, and when he loses his father, he lives off of his mother. But ultimately, he becomes, of course, more mature and the like. At 2B, the conflict we said, of course, we're concentrating on. The question, of course, is magic itself. Is it okay to use magic to get what you want? There's always been a tension in a number of these stories about that question. Should you work on your own inclinations and abilities, or should you rely on external sources like magic? At 3A, well, obviously we mentioned Disney's Aladdin. Think about the Telemachus story, right, from the Odyssey, and that whole notion of the Bildungsroman, as we call it in those lectures. The idea that young men grow up, and as they grow up, they got to go through all these challenges and all this stuff, and obviously Aladdin does that. A fun 3B question with the Aladdin story has always been, what would you wish for if you were allowed one wish? In the Aladdin story, actually, he gets multiple wishes. It's none of this 3 wishes thing. But if you could have one wish, what would that be? And would you be willing to use magic to get it? The other story that we'll speak about very quickly here is the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves story. It's another famous story. It's a motif story that we've seen recapitulated in lots and lots of texts. It's the story of two brothers, so we immediately think of the Cain and Abel motif, no doubt. Alibaba is the poor, hard-working brother, and Qasim is his brother who's married to a wealthy woman. Alibaba is cutting wood in the forest when he sees 40 thieves who are coming with their loot. And they come up to the cave and they say, "Open sesame," although the word sesame is hard to translate. Open sesame, sesame is the way the word is usually translated though in an English translation. Open sesame, and then into the cave they go. Upon departure, Alibaba goes in, he raids the cave, of course, once they're gone, and he comes back. But his brother, Qasim, putting some wax in the bottom of a scale that Alibaba's wife asks for to weigh out the jewels, is able to acquire some knowledge of what's going on. Qasim finds out then from Alibaba what's going on, and he goes to the cave to find the wonders there. But we always have this interesting motif in 1001 Nights where you will have a bad guy or a villain, not very bright, and Qasim is one of these. So he ends up getting into the cave by saying "Open sesame," but then once he's in there and he's so excited about getting all of his diamonds and jewelry and everything that he can't remember "Open sesame" as the command to get out. So when the thieves show up, we have the violence of the story. One of the things that shocks readers when they pick up the Arabian Nights is how unbelievably gratuitous violence is just all the way through. It's rampant all the way through, along with just really some questionable and very clearly identified sexual and violent sexual references as well. Anyway, the thieves show up. Qasim is caught. He's cut up into small body parts and hung in the cave as a way to demonstrate to any would-be visitors, you better stay out of the cave. We then will have the question of what happens when Alibaba shows up, because his bro never comes back home. And ultimately the body is taken to Qasim's wife, and there's this attempt to try and find some way to sew the body parts back together. I mean, I won't get into the nuances of this story, but we do meet Morgina. Morgina is a really famous character in this story, because she's a woman, she's a slave, she has no power whatsoever. Almost reminding us of the story, the original storyteller in Shaizdara, the idea that a woman can play a powerful and a pivotal role. Ultimately, she helps to defeat the leader or the captain of the bad guys, and kills all of his men through a very interesting situation with jars and hot oil and the like. She ultimately will stab the captain to death by dancing in front of him. Again, we got this storyline, beware beautiful women, especially dancing beautiful women. And she will kill him. Ultimately, Alibaba will say to Morgina, "You can marry my son in gratitude for what you've done." Alibaba, at the end of the story, is the only one who knows about the Cave of Treasures, and he passes it on to his sons. Therefore, you have your happy ending at the end of the story. Of course, in 2A, we have here a woman and, of course, a slave who saves the day. And we can already jump to 3A and think about, for example, Portia and the Merchant of Venice coming to mind. This notion of how a woman who is supposed to not be able to do some amazing things ultimately does these amazing things. At 2B, well, Alibaba, of course, we've got the conflict, but we've also got the symbolism. In many ways, he's symbolic and kind of representative of the fool, the kind of silly man who gets involved and then, ultimately has to have Morgina save him, right? Finally, at 3B, we could ask the question, what was the time that you were fooled or tricked by someone, but then you were able to turn around and reciprocate and fool or trick them? We'll have that same game being played. Well, this is an introduction again to the 1001 Nights. I hope that you can pick it up, but when you do, I hope that you will pay attention to the ways in which there's a lot of disturbing elements in this text. Especially its racism and its misogyny. There's no question that both of those, and its xenophobia, quite frankly, is a part of it as well. All of these stories, however, play that game, that notion that you have clever men and you have often not so clever men. Also, this notion of you have to beware of strangers and the ways in which strangers or those dressed incognito are going to play heavily in the telling of stories. There is no question this tension between male and female, the question of can you trust women is central to our reading of this text, no doubt. No question that many, many stories to follow will play this same game, where they have an entertainment quality, but there's also clearly political insight that's being played out here. With that in mind now, we will turn in our Harvard Classic Study to Volume 17 in the Grimm Brothers and the amazing stories that will come from a different tradition, from the German tradition. But again, will be extremely controversial stories. One of the things I want to kind of explain to you guys and help you to see is that some of the stories that we've grown up with as children and then later as we become adults, some of these stories have been distilled for us. If you read the original stories, and we're going to see this with our study of Volume 17 of the Grimm stories, you're going to see them as really dark and twisted stories, and we'll maybe have to ask why. And we'll maybe even ask, are these really children's stories in the end? Well, there you go, an introduction. I hope you'll maybe want to do more research on your own about the Arabian Nights. Thank you.